Our quote for today comes from a mother who writes, "I often worry about the safety of my children, especially the one that is rolling their eyes at me right now and looking back at me." Today we have the passage of Jesus' very first sermon, and obviously it did not go well because they wanted to throw him off the cliff on which the town of Nazareth was built. When we look for a moment just at Nazareth, today it's a rather large city, 80,000 inhabitants. It's 70% Muslim and Arab and 30% Christian. And it is really the Arab capital of Israel. But in the Lord's day, it was a pretty small village, about 300 to 500 people. They had their own synagogue. Eventually became more of a major city about the year 300 AD. The most important church that is there is the Basilica of the Annunciation, which is the largest church in the Middle East. Beautiful basilica built over Our Lady's house, built over the place where the Annunciation took place. As you know, the holy house where Joseph, Mary, and Jesus lived has been now in Loreto, Italy, but the basilica is built over the place where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The other beautiful chapel in Nazareth is called Our Lady of the Fright, and this is built on the side of, really on the top of the hill, partway up the cliff where they were going to throw the Lord off the cliff after he gave this sermon. So it's called Our Lady of the Fright because it says the townspeople were filled with fury and were going to kill the Lord after his very first sermon, after he preached in the synagogue in Nazareth. And so there's been an ancient chapel there, it goes way back. I know that the Crusaders also built a chapel there, that the Franciscans built a chapel in the 1800s, and about 10 years ago it was restored. And so you can go visit it today. So Nazareth, though, is an interesting town. It's in the north of Galilee, about halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea. And the word Nazareth actually means branch town, because Nazareth comes from Netzareth. Netzer is the Hebrew word for branch. And so the scholars believe that this would fulfill the prophecy that a shoot would sprout from the stump of Jesse, that a branch would come from the stump of Jesse. And so Nazareth is branch town, where the shoot came from Jesse's tree, the descendant of from David's line. So Nazareth, as we know, Scripture would say, he shall be called a Nazarene. So Jesus fulfilled all the prophecies, being born in Bethlehem, but being raised in Nazareth and called a Nazarene. And so it was fulfillment of the prophecies that Jesus would be raised in Branchtown, where he would fulfill the line of David. After the Babylonian exile, the faithful Jewish people that were descendants of King David settled in Nazareth, up in the north, to be away from the political center, which was Jerusalem, because they were, of course, of the true line of David. So they were the rightful heirs to the throne, but they had been displaced, and so they kept a low profile up in the area of Nazareth. So then we come to the Lord, it says, came into the synagogue as it was his custom. So the Lord attended the synagogue with Our Lady and St. Joseph every Saturday. The Lord had grown up there, but he began already his public ministry as a traveling rabbi and doing healings and miracles. And now he comes back to his hometown. And it says, when he entered, they gave him a scroll of the prophet Isaiah to read. These are days before books. And so he opened up the scroll, he unrolled the scroll to Isaiah chapter 61, which talked about the Messiah, the Anointed One. And it was common for lay people or traveling rabbis to be able to speak in the synagogue. It wasn't like the Temple of Jerusalem, which was run by the high priests and the other priests. The synagogues were run by lay people. So the Lord opened up the passage and read The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me. This is where we get the word Christ, which means the anointed one. So Jesus is the anointed one, the Christ of, namely the Son of God. And that he's come to bring about a jubilee year, a year acceptable to the Lord, a year of great joy. And then he hands back the scroll to the servant, the attendant, and he sits down. The rabbis always spoke from a chair called the chair of Moses, which symbolized the teaching authority of Moses as a rabbi, as a teacher. And he sat down to give the sermon, and he said, "Today this scripture passage is fulfilled in your hearing." Imagine that. For 1,000 years the Jewish people had waited for the anointed one, for the Messiah, and Jesus is claiming to be the Messiah. And at first everybody is amazed at the gracious words that came from the Lord's mouth, but then it dawned on them, we know him. He was born and raised in this area. He's a carpenter. Joseph, his father, was a carpenter. How can he be the Messiah, the anointed one? We've known him for 30 years, and this is the first time he's claiming to be the Messiah. So then the Lord continues with the sermon, talking about how God not only loves his chosen people, but he even shows his grace and blessing to the Gentiles as well, like the widow of Zarephath or Naaman the Syrian. In other words, showing that God's salvation will be extended not only to the Jews but to the Gentiles as well. It says the people heard this and they rose up in fury to take the Lord, and they drove him out of the town and led him to the brow of the hill where their town had been built, to hurl him over the cliff. And that's the exact place where Our Lady of the Fright Chapel is placed. But it says it was not his time, and he passed through their midst and went away. So I encourage you to think about this passage. Think about the town of Nazareth, how it is the branch town where the shoot came from the line of David, from Jesse's tree, and Jesus is the fulfillment of that. I'll just end with a very short passage from my dad's beautiful song called Mary of Nazareth. Mary knelt at Nazareth, and suddenly beneath her breath lay Jesus, and she loved him. Mary sang at Nazareth, and listened to the childhood breath of Jesus, and she loved him. Then he grew, and no one knew the wonder of her Son. The years of waiting done, he came to make all mankind one. Mary wept at Nazareth, remembering the dying breath of Jesus, and she loved him. And now the whole world's Nazareth, and in every one she hears the breath of Jesus, and she loves him.